Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
A Recluse by Walter de la Mare. Which of the world's wiseacres, I wonder, was responsible for the aphorism that the best things in life are to be found at its edges? It's too vague, of course. So much depends on what you mean by the best and the edges, and in any case most of us prefer the central. It has been explored, it's safe, you know where you are, it has been amply, copiously corroborated. But amusing? Well, hardly. Quite so, as my friend Mr. Bloom would have said. But then Mr. Bloom has now ventured over the borderline. He is, I imagine, interested in edges no longer. I have been reminded of him again, as if there were any need of it, by an advertisement in the Times. It announces that his house, which he had himself renamed Mon Trésor, is for sale by auction. This singularly charming freehold residential property, in all about 38 acres, the matured pleasure grounds of unusual beauty. I don't deny it, but was it quite discreet to describe the house as imposing? A pair of slippers in my possession prompts this query, but how to answer it? It is important in such matters to be clear and precise, and alas, all that I can say about Mr. Bloom can be only vague and inconclusive, as indeed in some respects he was. It was an afternoon towards the end of May, a Thursday. I had been to see a friend who, after a long illness, seemed now to be creeping back into the world again. We sat and talked for a while. Smiling, whispering, he lay propped up upon his pillows, gaunt and deathly, his eyes fixed on the green branches beyond his window, and that bleak, hungry look on his face one knows so well. But when we fell silent, and his nurse looked covertly round the door and nodded her head at me, I rose with an almost indecent readiness, clasped his cold, damp, bony hand in mine, and said goodbye. "You look miles better," I assured him again and again. It is a relief to leave a sick room, to breathe freely again after that fumy and stagnant atmosphere. The medicine bottles, the stuffiness, the hush, the dulcet optimism, the gauche self-consciousness. I even found myself softly whistling as I climbed back into my cosy two-seater again. A lime-tree bower her garage was. The flickering leafy evening sunshine gilded the dust on her bonnet. I released the brake. She leapt to life. And what wonder! Flora and her nymphs might at any moment turn the corner of this sequestered country road. I felt adventurous. It would be miserably unenterprising to go back by the way I had come. I would just chance my way home. Early evening is, with daybreak, May's most seductive hour, and how entrancing is any scene on earth after even a fleeting glance into the valley of shadows. The sun-striped, looping, wild-flowered lanes, the buttercup hollows, the parsleyed nooks and dusky coppices, the amorous birds and butterflies. But nothing lovely can long endure. The sickly fragrance of the hawthorns hinted at that. Drowsy, lush, tepid, inexhaustible, an English evening. And as I bowled idly on, I overtook a horseman. So far as I can see, he has nothing whatever to do with what came after, no more at most than my poor thin-nosed gasping friend. I put him in only because he put himself in, and in an odd way too, for at first sight and at a distance I had mistaken the creature for a bird, a large, strange, ungainly bird. It was the cardboard box he was carrying accounted for that. Many shades lighter than his clothes and his horse, it lay on his back, cornerwise, suspended about his neck with a piece of cord. As he trotted along he bumped in the saddle, and his box bumped too. Meanwhile, odd mechanical creature, he beat time to these bumpings on his animal's shoulder blade with the little leafy switch poised between his fingers. I glanced up into his face as I passed him, a greyish, hairy, indefinite face, like a miller's. To mistake a cardboard box for a bird. He amused me. I burst out laughing, never dreaming but that he was gone forever. 2 or 3 miles further on, after passing a huddle of tumble-down cottages and a duck pond, I caught my first glimpse of Mr. Bloom's house of Mont Trésor, and I defy anybody with eyes in his head to pass that house unheeded. The mere quite diffident looks of it brought me instantly to a standstill. Imposing. And as I sat on, looking in on it through its high wrought-iron gates, I heard presently the hollow thump of a horse's hoofs in the muffling dust behind me. Even before I glanced over my shoulder, I knew what I should see in my man on horseback. These narrow lanes. He must have taken a shortcut. There rode a miller on a horse, a jake on a jackass could do worse, with a hay and a hay lolly low. Meal on his chops and his whiskers too, the devil sowed tares where the tare crop grew, with a hay and a hay lolly low. Up he bumped, down he bumped, and his leafy switch kept time. When he drew level, I twisted my head and yelled up at him a question about the house. He never so much as paused. He merely lowered that indiscriminately hairy face of his a few inches nearer me, opened his mouth, and flung up his hand with the switch. Perhaps the poor fellow was dumb. His raw-boned horse had coughed, as if in sympathy. But dumb or not, the gesture had clearly intimated, though with unnecessary emphasis, that Mont Trésor wasn't worth asking questions about, that I had better move on. And naturally, it increased my interest. I watched him, out of sight. Why, as I say, I have mentioned him, I scarcely know, except that for an instant there he was, at those gates, Mr. Bloom's gates, from which Mr. Bloom himself was so soon to depart. When he was completely gone, and the dust of him had settled, I turned to enjoy another look at the house, a protracted look too. To all appearance it was vacant, but if so, it could not have been vacant long. The drive was sadly in need of weeding, though the lawns had been recently mown. High-grown forest trees towered round about it, overtopping its roof, chiefly chestnuts, their massive lower branches drooping so close to the turf they almost brushed its surface. They were festooned from crown to foot with branching candelabra-like spikes of blossom. Now it was daylight, but imagine them, on a still pitch-black night, their every twig upholding a tiny phosphoric cluster of tapers. Not that Mont Trésor, or rather what of its facade was in view, was an old or even in itself a very beautiful house. It must have been built about 1750, and at second sight was merely of pleasing proportions. And then one looked again, and it looked back, with a furtive reticence, as if it were withholding itself from any direct scrutiny behind its widespread blossoming chestnut trees. We could, if we would, said its windows, as do certain human faces, though no doubt the queer gesture and the queerer looks of my cardboard-boxed gentleman on horseback accounted for something of its effect. A thin haze of cloud had spread over the sky, paling its blue. The sun had set, and a diffused light hung over walls and roof. It suited the house, as powder may suit a pale face. Even nature appeared to be condoning these artifices, the hollow lawns, the honeyed azaleas. How absurd are one's little hesitations! All this while I had been debating whether to approach nearer on foot or to drive boldly in. I chose the second alternative, with the faint notion in my mind, perhaps, that it would ensure me, if necessary, a speedier retreat. But then, premonitions are apt to display themselves a little clearer in retrospect. Anyhow, if I had walked up to the house, that night would not have been spent with Mr. Bloom. But no, the house looked harmless enough and untenanted. I pushed open the gates, and gliding gently in under the spreading chestnut trees towards the entrance, again came to a standstill. A wide, low porte cochère, supported by slender stone columns, sheltered the beautiful doorway. The metalwork of its fanlight, like that of the gates, was adorned with the device of a pelican feeding her young, the owner's crest, no doubt. But in spite of the simplicity of the porch, it was not in keeping, and may have been a later addition to the house. Its hollow echoing stilled, I sat on in the car, idly surveying the scene around me, and almost without conscious thought of it. What state of mind can be more serene or more active? No notice whatever seemed to have been taken of my intrusion. Silence remained. Indeed, in spite of the abundant cover around me, there was curiously a little bird song, only a faraway thrush calling faintly, "Ahoy, ahoy, ahoy! Come to tea, come to tea!" And after all, it was the merry month of May, and still early. But near at hand, not even a wren shrilled. So presently, I got out of the car and mooned off to the end of the shallow stone-vased terrace, stepping deliberately from tuft to tuft of grass and moss. Only a dense shrubbery beyond, yew, ilex, holly, a dampish winding walk. But on this, the western aspect of the house, there showed faded blinds to the windows, and curtains too, bleached by numberless sunsets, but still rich and pleasant in colour. What few live things may have spied out the intruder had instantly withdrawn. I sighed and turned away. The forsaken pierces quicker to the heart than by way of the mind. My green-winged car looked oddly out of place, even a little homesick, under the porch. She was as grey with dust as were my odd horseman's whiskers. I had come to the conclusion, quite wrongly, that, for the time being at least, the place was unoccupied, though possibly at any moment caretaker or housekeeper might appear. Indeed, my foot was actually on the step of the car, when, as if at a definite summons, I turned my head and discovered not only that the door was now open, but that a figure, Mr. Bloom's, was standing a pace or so beyond the threshold, his regard steadily fixed on me. Mr. Bloom, a memorable figure. He must have been well over 6 feet in height, but he carried his heavy head and heavy shoulders with a pronounced stoop. He was both stout and fat, and yet his clothes now hung loosely upon him, as if made to old measurements. A wide black morning coat and waistcoat, and brown cloth trousers. I noted in particular his elegant boots. They were adorned with what I had supposed was an obsolete device, imitation laces. A well-cut pair of boots, nonetheless, by a good maker. His head was bald on the crown, above a fine lofty forehead, but it wore a superfluity of side hair, and his face was bushily bearded. With chin drawn up a little, he was surveying me from under very powerful magnifying spectacles, his left hand resting on the inside handle of the door. He had taken me so much by surprise that for the moment I was speechless. We merely looked at one another, he with a more easily justifiable intentness than I. He seemed, as the saying goes, to be sizing me up, to be fitting me in, and it was his voice that at length set the porch echoing again. A voice, as might have been inferred from the look of him, sonorous but muffled, as if his beard interfered with its resonance. "I see you're interested in the appearance of my house," he was saying. The greeting was courteous enough, and yet extraordinarily impersonal. I made the lamest apologies, adding some trivial comment on the picturesqueness of the scene and the general evening effect. But of this I am certain. The one thing uppermost in my mind, even at this stage in our brief acquaintance, was the desire not to continue it. Mr. Bloom had somehow exhausted my interest in his house. I wanted to shake him off, to go away. He was an empty-looking man, in spite of his domed brow. If his house had suggested vacancy, so did he. And yet, I wonder. Far from countenancing this inclination, however, he was inviting me not to leave him. He was welcoming the interloper. With a slow, comprehensive glance to left and right, he actually stepped out at last under the porch, and with a peculiar, tentative gesture, thrust out a well-kept fleshy hand in my direction, as if with the intention of putting me entirely at my ease. He then stood solemnly scrutinizing my tiny car, which with him as solitary passenger would appear more like a perambulator. At a loss for any alternative, I withdrew a pace or so and took another long look at the facade, the blank windows, their red brick mouldings, the peeping chimney stacks, the quiet, serene sufficiency of it all. There was, I remember, a sorry little array of half-made abandoned martins' nests plastered up under the narrow jutting of the roof. But this craning attitude was fatiguing, and I turned and looked back at Mr. Bloom. Mr. Bloom apparently had not stirred. Thus inert, he resembled the provincial statue of some forgotten Victorian notability, his feet set close together in those neat polished indoor boots, his fat fingers on his watch chain, and now he seemed to be smiling at me out of his bluish-grey, rather prominent eyes, from under those thick, distorting glasses. He was suggesting that I should come in, an invitation innocent of warmth, but more pressing than mere words implied. To a mouse, the wreathing odour of toasted cheese before the actual trap comes into sight must be similar in effect. There was a suppressed eagerness in the eyes behind those glasses. They had rolled a little in their sockets, and yet even so, why should I have distrusted him? It would be monstrous to take this world solely on its face value. I was on the point of blurting out a churlish refusal when he stepped back and pushed the door open. The glimpse within decided me. For the hall beyond that hospitable gape was peculiarly attractive, not very lofty, but of admirable proportions. It was panelled in light wood, the carving on its cornice and pilasters tinged in here and there with gilt. From its roof hung 3 chandeliers of greenish-grey glass, entrancing things, resembling that mysterious exquisite ice that comes from Waterford. The evening light swam softly in through the uncurtained windows as if upon the stillness of a dream. Empty, it would have been a fascinating room, but just now it was grotesquely packed with old furniture, beautiful, costly things in themselves, but in this hugger-mugger, robbed of all elegance and grace. Only the narrowest alleyway had been left unoccupied, an alleyway hardly wide enough to enable a human being to come and go without positively mounting up off the floor, as in the land and water game beloved of children. It might have been some antique furniture dealer's interior, prepared for a moonlight flit. Mr. Bloom smiled at the air of surprise which must have been evident in my face. "Here today?" he murmured, as if he were there and then preparing to be off, "and gone tomorrow." But having thus enticed me in under his roof, he rapidly motioned me on, not even turning his head to see if I were following him. For so cumbersome a man, he was agile. And at the dusky twist of the corridor, I found him already awaiting me, his hand on an inner door. "This is the library," he informed me, with a suavity that suggested that I was some wealthy visitor to whom he wished to dispose of the property. "One moment," he added hurriedly. "I think I neglected to shut the outer door." A library is often, in effect, little better than a mausoleum, but on a sunny morning this room must have looked as jocund as some beauty's boudoir. It was evening now. Dimmed old Persian rugs lay on the floor. There was a large writing table. The immense armchairs were covered with vermilion Morocco leather, and the walls, apart from a few engravings and mezzo tints, were lined with exquisitely bound books, and jade and geranium and primrose yellow were apparently Mr. Bloom's favourite colours. On one side many of the books had been removed and lay stacked up in portable bundles beneath the shelves on which they had stood. Opposite these was a lofty chimney-piece surmounted by mouldings in plaster, some pagan scene. And once again the self-sacrificing pelican showed in the midmost panel, still engaged in feeding her young. I was looking out of the long windows when Mr. Bloom reappeared. He still seemed to be smiling in his non-committal fashion, and treated me to yet another slow scrutiny. The most conspicuous feature of his person, apart from his spectacles, being at such moments the spade guinea that dangled from his watch chain. Brown trousers, my friend, I was thinking to myself. Why brown? And why not wear clothes that fit? "You are a lover of books?" he was murmuring, in that flat, muffled voice of his, and we were soon conversing amiably enough on the diversions of literature. He led me steadily from shelf to shelf, but for the time being he was only making conversation. He was definitely detaining me, and staved off every opportunity I attempted to seize of extricating myself from his company. At last I bluntly held out my hand, and in spite of his protestations, so insistent that he began stuttering, I made my way out of the room. Daylight was failing now, and the spectacle of that hoard of furniture in the gloaming was oddly depressing. Mr. Bloom had followed me out, cooing as he came on, his apologies and regrets that I could spare him no more time. "The upper rooms, the garden, my china." I persisted, nevertheless, and myself opened the outer door, and there, in the twilight, with as disconsolate an appearance as a cocker-spaniel that is wearied of waiting for its mistress, sat my car. I had actually taken my seat in it, having omitted to shake hands with Mr. Bloom, when I noticed not only that in a moment of absent-mindedness I must have locked the gears, but that the Yale gear key, which usually lay in the little recess on the left of the dashboard, was missing. Accidents of this kind may be absurdly disconcerting. I searched my pockets, leapt out, and searched them again, and not only in vain, but without the faintest recollection in my mind of having even touched the key. It was a ridiculous, a mortifying situation. With eyes fixed, in an effort to recall my every movement, I gazed over the wide green turf beneath the motionless chestnut trees, and then at last turned again and looked at Mr. Bloom. With plump hands held loosely and helplessly a little in front of him, and head on one side, he was watching my efforts with an almost paternal concern. "I've mislaid the key." I almost shouted at him as if he were hard of hearing. "Is it anything of importance? Can I get you anything? Water? A little grease?" That one word grease was accompanied with so ridiculous a trill that I lost patience. "It's a gear key," I snapped at him. "She's fixed, immovable, useless. I wish to heaven I stopped aimlessly, fretfully searching the porch and the turf beyond it. Mr. Bloom watched me with the solicitude of a mother. "I ought to have been home an hour ago," I stuttered over my shoulder. "Most vexatious, dear me, I am distressed, but my memory, too, a slough of despond. Do you think, by any chance, Mr. Dash, you could have put the key in your pocket?" I stared at him. The suggestion was little short of imbecile, and yet he had evidently had the sagacity to look for my name on my licence. "Well, what's the nearest town?" I all but shouted. "The nearest," he echoed. "The nearest. Now, let me see. The nearest town. Garage, of course. Nice question. Come in again. We must get a map. Yes, a map. Don't you think? That will be our best course. An excellent plan." I thrust my hand into the leather pocket of the car and produced my own, but only the eyes of an owl could have read its lettering in that light, and somehow it did not occur to me in this tranquil, dusky scene to switch on the lamps. There was no alternative. I followed Mr. Bloom into the house again, and on into his study. He lit a couple of candles, and we sat down together at the writing table and examined the map. It was the closest I ever got to him. The position was ludicrous. Montresor was a good 4 miles from the nearest village of any size, and 7 from the nearest railway station, and that on a branch line. And here was this recluse peppering me with futile advice and offers of assistance, and yet obviously beaming with satisfaction at the dilemma I was in. There was not even a servant in the house to take a telegram to the village, if a telegram had been of the slightest use. I hastily folded up my map. I folded it up wrong, of course, and sat glooming. He was breathing a little rapidly after this exercise of intelligence. "But why be disturbed?" he entreated me. "Why? A misadventure, but of no importance, indeed not. You will give me the pleasure of being my guest for the night. Nothing but happiness, I assure you. Say no more. It won't incommode me in the slightest degree. This old house is a most unfortunate accident. They should make larger, heavier keys. Ridiculous. But then I'm no mechanic. He stooped round me, the loose, copious creature, and was almost flirtatious. Frankly, my dear young sir, I cannot regret an accident that promises me more of your company. We bookish people, you understand. I protested, stood up, and once more began searching my pockets. His head jerked back into its habitual posture. I see what's on your mind. Think nothing of it. Yes. Comforts, convenience, curtailed. I agree. But my good housekeeper always prepares a meal sufficient for two. Mere habit. Mr. Dash. Almost animal habit. And besides, why not? I will forage for myself. A meal miscellaneous, perhaps, but not unsatisfying. He beamed. Why not take a look at the garden meanwhile, before it's dark? The tones had fallen still flatter. The face had become impassive. I was cornered. It was useless to protest. It would have been atrociously uncivil. He himself thrust open the windows for me. Fuming within, I stumped out onto the terrace while he went off to forage. I saw, in fancy, those thick spectacles eyeing the broken meats in the great larder. What was wrong with the man? What made him so extortionately substantial and yet, in effect, so elusive and unreal? What indeed constitutes the reality of any fellow creature? The something, the someone within, surely. Not the mere physical frame. In Mr. Bloom's company, that physical frame seemed to me mainly a kind of stalking horse. If so, the fowler was exquisitely intent on not alarming his prey, those honeyed decoy notes. But then, what conceivably could he want with me? Whom had he been waiting for, skulking there at some convenient window? Why was he alone in this great house? Only Mr. Bloom could answer these questions, and owing to some odd scruple of manners or what-not, I couldn't put them to him. Ridiculous. My mind at this time had wearied of these vexations, and had begun to follow my eyes. I was looking southward. A clear lustre, as of glass, was in the heavens. It had been a calm but almost colourless sunset, and westward the evening star floated like a morsel of silver in a dove-grey fleece of cloud, drawn gently across the fading blue of the horizon. The countryside lay duskily purple and saturnine, and about 100 yards away in this direction was a wide stretch of water, dead white under the sky, a lake that must have been thronged with wildfowl, yet not so much as a peewit crying. In front of me, the garden was densely walled in with trees, and an exceedingly skilful topiarian had been at work on the nearer yews. Year after year he must have been clipping his birds and arches and vast mushrooms and even an obelisk. They were now in their freshest green. Mr. Bloom's servants cannot have forsaken him in a batch. They were gone, though. Not a light showed in the dusk, no movement, no sound except out at a fair distance. Presently the faint hypnotic churring of a nightjar. It is the bird of woody solitude. Well, there'd be something of a moon that night, I knew. She would charm out the owls, and should at least ensure me a lullaby. But why this distaste, this sense of inward disquietude? And suddenly I wheeled about at a sound, as I thought of a footstep. But no, I was alone. Mr. Bloom must still be busy foraging in his back quarters or his cellarage. And yet, is it credible? Once more, in a last forlorn hope, I began to search my pockets for the missing key. But this time Mr. Bloom interrupted the operation. He came out, sleeking his hands together in front of him and looking as amiably hospitable as a churchwarden at a parochial soiree. He led me in, volubly explaining the while that since he had been alone in the house, he had all but given up the use of the upper rooms. As a matter of fact, I'm preparing to leave, he told me, as soon as it is convenient. Meanwhile, I camp on the ground floor. There is many a novelty in the ordinary routine of life, Mr. Dash, that we seldom enjoy. It amused my secretary, this system of picnicking, poor fellow, at least for a while. It came to a standstill on the threshold of the room into which he was leading me. A cluster of candles burned on the long oak table set out for our evening meal, but otherwise the room, larger than the study and containing, apart from its cabinets of china and old ivory, almost as many books, was thickly curtained and in gloom. "I must explain," he was saying, and he laid the 4 fingers of his left hand very gently on my shoulder, "that my secretary has left me. He has left me for good. He is dead." With owl-like solemnity he scrutinized the blank face I turned on him, as if he were expectant of sympathy, but I had none to give. You cannot even feign sympathy without some preparation. Mr. Bloom glanced over his shoulder into the corridor behind us. "He's been a great loss," he added. "I miss him. On the other hand," he added more cheerfully, "we mustn't allow our personal feelings to interfere with the enjoyment of what I am afraid, even at best, is a lamentably modest little meal." Again, Mr. Bloom was showing himself incapable of facing facts. It was by no means a modest little meal. Our cold bouillon was followed by a pair of spring chickens, the white sauce on their delicate breasts adorned in a chaste design with fragments of cucumber, truffle, and mushroom, hapless birds that seemed to have been fattened on cowslips and honeysuckle buds. There was an asparagus salad so cold to the tongue as to suggest ice, and neighbouring it were old silver dishes of meringues and an amber-coloured wine jelly, thickly clotted with cream. After the sherry champagne was our only wine, and it was solely owing to my abstemiousness that we failed to finish the second bottle. Between mouthfuls, Mr. Bloom indulged in general conversation of the exclamatory order. It covered a pretty wide autobiographical field. He told me of his boyhood in Montresor. The estate had been in his family for close on 2 centuries. For some years he had shared it with the last of his 3 sisters, now all dead. "She's there!" he exclaimed, pointing an instant with uplifted fork at a portrait that hung to the right of the chimney-piece. "And that's my mother." I glanced up at Miss Bloom, but she was looking in the other direction, and our real and painted eyes did not meet. It seemed incredible that these 2 could ever have been children, have played together, giggled, quarrelled, made it up. Even if I could imagine the extinguished lady in the portrait as a little girl, no feat of fancy could convert Mr. Bloom into a small boy, a sufferable one, I mean. By the time I had given up the attempt, and having abandoned the jelly, we had set to work on some camembert cheese. Mr. Bloom's remarks about his secretary had become almost aggrieved. "He was of indispensable use to me in my literary work," he insisted as he chowed rapidly on. "Modest enough in itself. I won't trouble you with that. Only an obscure byway of interest. Indispensable. We differed in our views, of course. No human beings ever see perfectly eye to eye on such a topic. In a word, the occult. But he had an unusual flair, of which he himself, you'll hardly believe it, until he came to me, was completely ignorant." He laid his left hand on the table. "I'm not denying that for one moment. We succeeded in attaining the most curious and interesting results from our little experiments. I could astonish you." I tried in vain to welcome the suggestion, but the light, even of only 6 candles, is a little stupefying when one has to gaze through them at one's host, and Mr. Bloom was sitting up immediately opposite to me on the other side of the table. "My own personal view," he explained, "is that his ill health was in no way due to these investigations. It was, I assure you, against my wish that he should continue them even on his own account. Flatly, 2 heads, 2 wills, 2 cautions even are better than one in such matters. Dr. Ponsonby, I should explain that Dr. Ponsonby is my medical adviser. He attended my poor sister in her last illness. Dr. Ponsonby, unfortunately, lives at some little distance, but he did not hesitate to sacrifice all the time he could spare. On the other hand, as far as I can gather, he was not in the least surprised that when the end came, it came suddenly. My secretary, Mr. Dash, was found dead in his bed, that is, in his bedroom. Speaking for myself, I should—" Back went his head again, and once more his slightly bolting eyes gazed out at me like polished agates across the silvery lustre of the candlelight. "Speaking for myself?" His voice had muffled itself almost into the inarticulate beneath his beard. "I should prefer to go quickly, when I have to go at all." The white plump hand replenished his glass with champagne. "Not that I intend to imply that I have any immediate desire for that. While as for you, my dear young sir," he added almost merrily, having enjoyed only a morsel of my experience in this world, "you must desire that consummation even less." "You mean to die, Mr. Bloom?" I put it to him. His chin lowered itself into his collar again. The eyelids descended over his eyes. "Precisely, though it is as well to remember there is more than one way of dying. There is first the body to be taken into account, and there is next what remains, though nowadays, of course, well, I leave it to you." Mr. Bloom was a peculiar conversationalist. Like an astute letter-writer, he ignored questions in which he was not interested or which he had no wish to answer, and with the agility of a chimpanzee in its native wilds would swing off from a topic not to his liking to another that up to that point had not even been hinted at. Quite early in our extravagantly tete-a-tete meal, I began to suspect that the secret of his welcome to a visitor who had involuntarily descended on him from out of the blue was an insensate desire to hear himself talk. His vanity was elephantine. Events proved this surmise to be true only in part, but in the meantime it became pretty evident why Mr. Bloom should be in want of company. I mean of ordinary human company. Though he seemed to have wearied of his secretaries some little time before that secretary had been summoned away. "You'll agree, my dear sir, that to see eye to eye with an invalid for any protracted period is a severe strain. Illness breeds fancies, not all of them considerate. Not a happy youth ever introspective and introvert in the cant term of our time, but still meaning well, and oh yes, endeavouring not to give way when in company. My sister never really liked him either, not at all. But then, she was the prey of conventions that are yet for some perhaps a safeguard. We shared the same interests, of course, he and I. Our arrangement was based on that. He had his own views, but was at times, oh yes, he filled his glass again, exceedingly obstinate about them. He had little staying power. He began to fumble, to hesitate, to question, to fluster himself, and me too, for that matter, at the very moment, perhaps, when we were arriving at an excessively interesting juncture. You know the general process, of course. He had glanced up over his food at me, but not in order to listen to any answer I might have given. "It is this," and he forthwith embarked on a long and tedious discourse concerning the sweet uses of the planchette, of automatic writing, table rapping, the hidden slate, ectoplasm, and all the other, to me rather disagreeable, paraphernalia of the spiritualistic seance. Nothing I could say or do, not even unconcealed and deliberate yawning, had the least effect on Mr. Bloom's fluency. Lung trouble appeared to have been the primary cause of his secretary's final resignation. But if the unfortunate young man had night after night been submitted to the experience that I was now enduring, exasperation and boredom alone would have accounted for it. How on earth, indeed, I asked myself, could he have endured Mr. Bloom so long? I ceased to listen. The cascade of talk suddenly came to an end. Mr. Bloom laid his hands on either side of his dessert plate, and once more fixed me in silence under his glasses. "You yourself have possibly dabbled a little in my hobby?" he inquired. I had indeed. In my young days my family had possessed an elderly female friend, a Miss Allgood. She had been one of my mother's bridesmaids, and it was an unwritten law in our household that all possible consideration and affection should be shown to her in all circumstances. She, poor soul, had come down in the world, until indeed she had come down at last to one small room on the top floor in lodgings in Westbourne Park. She was gaunt, loquacious, and affectionate, and she had a consuming interest in the other world. I hear her now. "On the other side, my dear Charles, another plane, Charles, when I myself pass over." It is curious, she was absolutely fearless and quixotically independent. For old sake, and I am afraid for very little else, I used to go to tea with her occasionally, and we would sit together, the heat welling up out of the sun-struck street outside her window, and she would bring out the hateful little round Victorian table, and the wine-glass and the cardboard alphabet, and we would ask questions of the unseen, the mischievous, and the half-crazy concerning the unknowable. And she would become flushed and excited, her lean hands trembling, while she urged me now to empty my mind and now to concentrate. And though I can honestly say I never deliberately tampered with that execrable little wine-glass in its wanderings over the varnished table, and though she herself never, so far as I could detect, deliberately cooked the messages it spelt out for us, we enjoyed astonishing revelations. Revelations such as an intelligent monkey or parrot might invent, yet which by any practical test proved utterly valueless. These spiritistic answers to our cross-examination were at the same time so unintelligibly intelligent and so useless and futile that I had been cured once and for all of the faintest interest in the other side. Thus disclosed, I mean. If anything, in fact, the experience had even a little tarnished the side Mr. Bloom now shared with me. For this reason alone, his first mention of the subject had almost completely taken away my appetite for his chicken, his jelly, and his champagne. After all, that other side's borderline, from which, according to the poet, no traveller returns, must be a good many miles longer even than the wall of China, and not all its gates can lead to plains of peace or paradise, or even of mere human endurableness. I explained at last to Mr. Bloom that my interest in spiritualism was of the tepidest variety. Alas, his prominent stone-blue eyes, lit up as they were by this concentrated candlelight, incited me to be more emphatic than I intended. I told him I detested the whole subject. I'm convinced, I assured him, that if the messages, communications, or whatever you like to call them, that you get that way are anything else than the babblings and mumblings of subconsciousness, a deadly dubious term in itself, then they are probably the work of something or somebody even more sub than that. Convinced. I knew, of course, practically nothing at first hand about the subject. Miss Allgood, poor soul, was only the fussiest and flimsiest of amateurs, but ignorance with a glimmer of intuition perhaps gives one assurance. Whatever I have heard, I told him flatly, from that source, of the future I mean, which awaits us when we get out of this body of ours, Mr. Bloom, fills me with nothing but regret that this life is not the end of everything. I don't say that you go nowhere, even by that route, and I don't say that you mayn't get further some day than you intend, but, and I stupidly blustered on, my own personal opinion is that the whole business so conducted is a silly and dangerous waste of time. His eyes never wavered. He lowered his head by not so much as the fraction of an inch, and then, as if in an aside, his lips hardly stirring, he ejaculated, "Quite so, but not exactly nowhere, it may be." And then, as I sat looking at him, it's difficult to put it into words, his face went out, so to speak. It became a face not only abandoned, but forsaken, and he once again looked out at me with a leer of triumph, an almost coquettish vanity, though he blinked a little, as if the light offended him, and as if he were trying to conceal the fact that he had not much appreciated the scene or the state which he had come from. He gave me no time to reflect on this piece of buffoonery. So, he was informing me, shut us up or shut us down, we are what we are, and all that you have been saying, my dear Mr. Dash, amuses me. Extraordinary, most amusing, illuminating, quite so, capital. You tell me that you know nothing about the subject. Precisely. And that it is silly and dangerous. Ah, yes, and why not? Dangerous! Well, one word in your ear. Here, my dear sir, we are in the very thick of it, a positive hot-bed. But if there is one course I should avoid— His eyes withdrew themselves, and the thick glasses blazed into the candlelight once more. It would be that of taking any personal steps to initiate you into our mysteries. No, I shall leave the matters completely to themselves. He'd scarcely raised his voice. His expression had never wavered. He continued to smile at me. Only his thick fingers trembled a little on the tablecloth. But he was grey with rage. It seemed even that the scalp of his head had a little raised the hair on its either side, so intense was his resentment. "A happy state ignorance, Mr. Dash, that of our first parents." And then, like a fool, I flared up and mentioned Mrs. Allgood. He listened, steadily smiling. "I see a superannuated novice, a would-be professional medium," he insinuated at last with a shrug of his great, heavy shoulders. "You pay your money and you take your choice." "Pah! Banal!" I hotly defended my well-meaning, sentimental old friend. "Oh, indeed, a retired governess and an old maid." And once more his insolence nearly mastered him. "Have no fear, Mr. Dash, she is not on my visiting list. There are deeps and vasty deeps." With that he thrust out a hand and snatched up the chicken bone that lay on my plate. "Come out here," he called boldly. "Here, you." His head dipped out of sight as he stooped, and a yellowish dog, with a white gleaming sidelong eye, of which up to present I had seen or heard no sign, came skulking out from under a chair in the corner of the room to enjoy its evening meal. For a while only the crunching of teeth on bones broke the silence. "Greedy you glutton," Mr. Bloom was cajoling him. "Aye, but where's Steve? An animal's intelligence, Mr. Dash." His voice floated up to me from under the other side of the table. "Is situated in his belly, and even when one climbs up to human prejudices, one usually detects as primitive a source." For an instant I could make no reply to this pleasantry. He took advantage of the pause to present me with a smile, and at the same moment filled a little tulip-shaped glass for me with green chartreuse. There, I refuse to disagree," he was saying. "Your company has been very welcome to me, and, well, one should never embark on one's little private preserves without encouragement. My own, in particular, meet with very scant courtesy usually. That animal could tell a tale." The crunching continued. "Couldn't you, you old rascal? Where's Steve? Where's Steve? Now, get along back." The scrunching ceased. The yellowish dog retreated into its corner. "And now, Mr. Dash," declared Mr. Bloom, "if you have sufficiently refreshed yourself, let us leave these remains. These last few months I have detested being encumbered with servants in the house. A foreign element. They are further away from us, I assure you, in all that really matters, than that rascal. Chunks, there in the corner, eh? Hey, you old devil," he called at his pet. "Ain't it so? Now let me see." He took out his watch, a gold half-hunter, its engraving almost worn away with long service. 9 o'clock. Just 9. We have a long evening before us. Believe me, I am exceedingly grateful for your company and regret that... But there, I see you have already condoned an old man's foibles. There was something curiously aimless, even pathetic, in the tone of that last remark. He had eaten with excellent appetite, and had accounted for at least 4/5 of our champagne. But he rose from the table looking more dejected than I should have supposed possible, and shuffled away in his slippers, as if the last 10 minutes had added years to his age. He was leading the way with one of the candlesticks in his hand, but to avoid their guttering, I suppose, had blown out 2 of its candles. A dusky moonlight loomed beyond the long-hinged windows of his study. The faint earthy odour of spring and night saturated the air, for one of them was open. He paused at sight of it, glancing about him. "If there is an animal I cannot endure," he muttered over his shoulder at me, "it is the cat, the feline cat. They have a history. They retreat into the past. We meet them in far other circumstances." Yes. He had closed and bolted the window, drawn shutters and curtains while he was speaking. "And now, bless my soul, Mr. Dash, how about your room? A room for you. I ought to have thought of that before. Bachelor habits. Now, where shall we be put?" With feet close together, he stood looking at me. "My secretary's now. Would that meet the case?" He was a creature for comfort, but one of his fancies, reluctances perhaps, As I say, the upper rooms are all bare, dismantled, though we might together put up a camp bed and water in the bathroom. I myself sleep in here. He stepped across and drew aside a curtain hung between the bookcases, but there was not light enough to see beyond it. The room I propose is also on this floor, so we should not, if need be far apart, eh? What think we? Well, now, come this way. He paused. Once more he led me out and stopped at the third door of the corridor on the left-hand side. So long was this pause, one might have supposed he was waiting for permission to enter. I followed him in. It was a lofty room, a bed and sitting room combined, and its curtains and upholstery were of a pale purple. Its window was shut, the air stuffy and faintly sweet. The bed was in the further corner to the left of the window, and there again the dusky moonlight showed. I stood looking at the mute, inanimate things around me in that blending of the two faint lights. No doubt, if I had been ignorant that the owner, or rather user of the room, had made his last exit thence, I should have noticed nothing unusual in its stillness, its vacant calm. And yet, well, I had left a friend only that afternoon, still a little breathless after he scrambled up the nearer bank of the Jordan. And now this was the last place on earth, these four walls, these colours, this bookcase, that table, that window, which Mr. Bloom's secretary had set eyes on before setting out not to return. My host watched me. He would, I think, have shut and pulled the curtains over these windows too, if I had given him opportunity. How's that, then? You think you will be... but there, I hesitate to press the matter. In fact, Mr. Dash, this is the only room I can offer you. I mumbled my thanks and assured him, not very graciously, that I should be comfortable. "Capital!" cried Mr. Bloom. "Eureka! My only apprehension... well, you know how touchy, how sensitive people can be. Why, my dear Mr. Dash, in a world as superannuated as ours is, every other mouthful of air we breathe must have been somebody's last. I'll leave you reconciled, then. You'll find me in the study, and I can promise you that one little theme shall not intrude on us again. The bee may buzz, but Mr. Bloom will keep his bonnet on. The fourth door on the right, after turning to your right, down the corridor. Ah, I'm leaving you no light." He lit the twin wax candles on his late secretary's dressing table and withdrew. I myself stood for a while, gazing stupidly out of the window. In spite of his extraordinary fluency, Mr. Bloom, I realized, was a secretive old man. I had realized all along, of course, that it was not my beautiful eyes he was after, nor even my mere company. The old creature, admirable mask though his outward appearance might be, was on edge. He was detesting his solitude, though until recently, at any rate, it had been the one aim of his life. It had even occurred to me that he was not much missing his secretary. Quite the reverse. He'd spoken of him with contempt, but not exactly with the contempt one feels for the completely gone and worsted. Two things appeared to have remained unforgiven in Mr. Bloom's mind, indeed. Some acute disagreement between them, and the fact that Mr. Champneys had left him without due notice, unless inefficient lungs constitute due notice. I took one of the candles and glanced at the books. They were chiefly of fiction and a little poetry, but there was one on mosses, one on English birds, and a little medical handbook in green cloth. There was also a complete row of manuscript books with pig-skinned backs labelled Proceedings. I turned to the writing table. A little air of interest, a stopped clock, a dried-up inkwell, a tarnished silver cup, and one or two more books, The Sentimental Journey, a Thomas à Kempis bound in limp maroon leather. I opened the Thomas à Kempis and read the spidery inscription on the flyleaf, "To darling Sydney, with love from Mother, F.C." It startled me, as if I'd been caught spying. Life surely should never come quite to this. Some secret sentimental voice within piped out of the void. I shut the book up. The drawer beneath contained only envelopes and letter paper, Mon Trésor in large pale blue letters on a Silurian background, and a black book, its cover stamped with the word Diary, and on the flyleaf SS Champneys. I glanced up then turned to the last entry, dated only a few months before, just a few scribbled words. Not me, at any rate. Not me, but even if I could get away for... The ink was smudged and had left its ghost on the blank page opposite it. A mere scrap of handwriting, and that poor hasty smudge of ink. They resembled an incantation. Mr. Bloom's secretary seemed also to be intent on sharing his secrets with me. I shut up that book too and turned away. I washed my hands in SSC's basin and, with my fingers, did my hair in his glass. I even caught myself beginning to undress, sheer reluctance, I suppose, to go back and face another cataract of verbiage. To my astonishment, a log fire was handsomely burning in the grate when at length I returned to the study, and Mr. Bloom, having drawn up two of his voluminous vermilion armchairs in front of it, was now deeply and amply encased in one of them. He'd taken off his spectacles and appeared to be asleep, but his eyes opened at my footsteps. He had been merely resting, perhaps. "I hope," was his greeting, "you found everything needful, Mr. Dash, in the circumstances?" He called this up at me as if I were deaf or at a distance, but his tone subsided again. "There's just one little matter we missed, eh? Night attire. Not that you wouldn't find a complete trousseau to choose from in the wardrobe. My secretary, in fact, was inclined to the foppish. No blame, no blame. Fine leathers, Mr. Dash." It is, thank heaven, an unusual experience to be compelled to spend an evening as the guest of a stranger one distrusts. It was not only that Mr. Bloom's manner was obviously a mask, but even the occasional stupidity of his remarks seemed to be an affectation, and one of an astute and deliberate kind, and yet Montrésor in itself was a house of unusual serenity and charm. Its urbane 18th-century reticence showed in every panel and moulding. One fell in love with it at first sight, as with an open smiling face, and then a look in the eyes. It reeked of the dubious and distasteful. But how can one produce definite evidence for such sensations as these? They lie outside the tests even of science, as do a good many other things that refuse to conform with the norm of human evidence. Mr. Bloom's company at a dinner party, or conversazione, shall we say, might have proved refreshingly droll. He did his best to make himself amusing. He'd read widely, and in out-of-the-way books, too, and he had an unusual range of interests. We discussed music and art, and he brought out portfolio after portfolio of drawings and etchings to illustrate some absurd theory he had of the one, and played a scrap or two of Debussy and of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit to prove some far-fetched little theory of his own about the other. We talked of chance and dreams and disease and hereditary, edged on to woman and skated rapidly away. He dismissed life as an episode in disconcerting surroundings and scuttled off from a detraction of St. Francis of Assisi to the problem of pain. "Mr. Dash, we fear pain too much, and the giving of it. The very mention of the word stifles us, and how unchristian." The look he peeked down at me at this was proof enough that he was intent only on leading me on and drawing me out. But I was becoming a little more cautious, and mumbled that that kind of philosophy best begins at home. "Aye, indeed, a retort, with charity on the one side of the hearth in a mob cap and carpet slippers, I suppose. I see the dear creature, I see her. Still, you will agree, even you will agree, that once, Mr. Dash, the head has lost its way in the heart, one's brain pan might as well be a basin of soap bubbles. A man of feeling by all means, but just a trace, a soupçon of rationality. Well, it serves, eh?" A few minutes afterwards, in the midst of a discourse on the progress of human thought, he suddenly inquired if I cared for the game of backgammon. "Why not? Or draughts, or solitaire, Mr. Dash. A grossly underestimated amusement." But all this badinage, these high spirits, were clearly an elaborate disguise, and none too complimentary one at that. He was keeping it up to keep me up, and maybe to keep himself up. Much of it was automatically, mere mental antics, like a Tibetan praying wheel. His mind went round and round, and his attention was divided. One at least of those long, fleshy, hairy ears was cocked in another direction. And at last the question that had been on my tongue throughout most of the evening popped out almost inadvertently. I asked if he was expecting a visitor. At the moment his round black back was turned on me. He was rummaging in a corner cupboard for glasses to accompany the decanter of whisky he'd produced, his head turned slyly on his heavy shoulders. "A visitor? You astonish me. Here? Now? As if, my dear Mr. Dash, this rural retreat were Bloomsbury or Mayfair. You amuse me. Qualous, thank heaven, not so. You came, you saw, but you did not expect a welcome. The unworthy tenant of Mon Trésor took you by surprise. Confess it. So be it. And why not? There are surmises, intuitions, forebodings, to give a pleasant tinge to the word. Yes, I agree. I was on the watch, patiently. In due time, your charming little car appears at my gate. You pause. I say to myself, here he is. Company at last. Discussion, powwow, even controversy, perhaps. Why not? We're sharing the same hemisphere, plain as a pikestaff. I foresaw your decision as may the shepherd in contemplation of a red sunrise foresee the deluge. I stepped downstairs, and here we are. My reply came a little more warmly than I intended. I assured Mr. Bloom that if it had not been for the loss of my key, I shouldn't have stayed 5 minutes. I prefer not to be expected in this strange house. It was unutterably gauche. He chuckled, he shrugged his shoulders, he was vastly amused. But are we not forgetting that such little misadventures are merely part and parcel of the general plan, the end-shaping process, as the poet puts it? What general plan? Mr. Dash, when you fire out your inquiries at me like bullets out of the muzzle of a gun, I am positively disconcerted. I can scarcely keep my wits together. Pray, let us no longer treat each other like witnesses in the witness box, or even— a cat-like smile crept into his face, like prisoners in the dock. Have a little whisky, pure malt. A tot? It may be whimsical, but for me one of the few exasperating things about my poor secretary, Mr. Champness, was his aversion to alcohol. His own word. £300 a year, Mr. Dash, no less, and everything found. No expenses except tobacco, shockers, his own word again, pyjamas, tooth powder, and petrol, a motor bicycle, in fact, soon hors de combat, and alcohol, if you please, the libel, these specialists. Soda water or Apollinaris? In sheer chagrin, I drank the stuff and rose to turn in. Not a bit of it. With covert glances at his watch, Mr. Bloom kept me there, by hook and by crook, until it was long past midnight, and try as he might to conceal it, the disquietude that had peeped out earlier in the evening became more and more obvious. The only effect of this restlessness on his talk, however, was to increase its volume and incoherence. If Mr. Bloom had been play-acting, and had been cast for his own character, his improvisations could not have been more masterly. He made no pretence now of listening to my own small part in this display, and when he did, it was only in order to attend to some other business he had in mind. Ever and again, as if to emphasize his point, he would haul himself up out of his deep-bottomed chair and edge off towards the door, with the pretense, perhaps, of looking for a book. He would pause there, but for an instant, and the bumbling, muffled voice would yet again take up the strain. Once, however, he came to a dead stop, raised his hand, and openly stood listening. "A nightingale, certainly, if not two," he murmured sotto voce. "But tell me, Mr. Dash," he called softly out across the room, "was I deceived into thinking I heard a distant knocking? In a house as large as this, articles of some value, perhaps, we read even of violence. You can never tell?" I inquired with clumsy irony if there would be anything remarkable in a knocking. Don't your friends ever volunteer even a rap or two of their own account? I should have supposed it would have been the least they could offer. A signal, a rap or two, he echoed me blandly. Why that? From the other side. Eh? He suddenly broke off, his cheek whitening, the sole cause of his dismay being merely a scratching at the door panel, announcing that his faithful pet had so much wearied of solitude in the dining room that he had come seeking even his master's company. But Mr. Bloom did not open the door. "Be off!" he called at the panel. "Away, sir, to your mat! That dog, Mr. Dash, is more than human, or shall we say less than human." The words were jovial enough, but the lips that uttered them trembled beneath his beard. I'd had enough, and this time had my way. He accompanied me to the door of the study, but not further, and held out his hand. "If by any chance," he scarcely more than murmured, "you should want anything in the night, you will remember, of course, where to find me. I'm in there," he pointed. "On the other hand," he laid his hand again on my arm, deprecatingly almost, as if with shy affection, "I'm an exceedingly poor sleeper, and occasionally I find a brief amble round proves a sedative. Follow me up at any alarm, eh? I should welcome it, but tonight I expect nothing." He drew to the door behind him. "Have you ever tried my own particular little remedy for insomnia? Cold air, and perhaps a hard biscuit to humour the digestion, but fol lol, young man, no. The machine comparatively new. My housekeeper returns at 6, breakfast I hope at 8:30, a most punctual woman, a treasure. But then, servants, I detest the whole race of them. Good night, and none of those proceedings, I warn you." But even now I had not completely shaken him off. He hastened after me, puffing as he came, and clutched at my coat sleeve. "What I was meaning, Mr. Dash, is that I have never attempted to make converts. A fruit, let me tell you, that from being at first incredibly raw and unwholesome, rapidly goes rotten. Besides, my secretary had very little talent for marshalling facts. That's why I mentioned the proceedings. A turn for writing, maybe, but no method. Just that. And now, of course, you must go. Our evening is at an end. But who knows? Of course, never matter. What must come, comes." At last I was free, though a hoarse whisper presently pursued me down the corridor. "No need for caution, Mr. Dash. Should you need me, no infants, no invalids. Sleep well." Having put my candlestick on the table, shut the door of Mr. Champney's bedroom, and very cautiously locked it, I sat down on the bed to think things over. Easier said than done. The one thing in my mind was relief at finding myself alone again, and of extreme distaste, as I wound my watch, at the recollection of how many hours still remained before dawn. I opened the window and looked out. My room was at the back of the house. Then, and over yonder, must lie the lake, ebon black under the stars. I listened for the water birds, but no sound. Mr. Bloom's nightingales, too, if not creatures of his imagination, had ceased to lament. A ground mist wreathed the boles of the chestnut trees, soundlessly lapping their lowermost boughs. I drew in. The draught had set my candles guttering. Almost automatically I opened one of the long drawers in Mr. Champney's chest. It was crammed with his linen. Had he no relatives then, I wondered? Or had Mr. Bloom succeeded to his property? Such gay pyjamas would grace an Arabian prince, of palest blue silk with SSC in beautiful scarlet lettering. It was needlessly fastidious, perhaps, but I left them undisturbed. There were a few photographs above the chimney-piece, but photographs of the relatives and friends of a deceased stranger are not exhilarating company. Mr. Champney's himself being dead, they seemed to be tinged with the same eclipse. One of them was a snapshot of a tall, dark young man in tennis clothes. He was smiling. He had a longish nose, a tennis racket was under his arm, and a tiny strip of maroon and yellow ribbon had been glued to the glass of the frame. Another Champney's, a brother, perhaps. I stood there, idly gazing at it for minutes together, as if in search of inspiration. No talker has ever more completely exhausted me than Mr. Bloom. Even while I was still deep in contemplation of the photograph, I was seized suddenly with a series of yawns almost painful in their extremity. I turned away. My one longing was for the bathroom. But no, Mr. Bloom had failed to show me the way there, and any attempt to find it for myself might involve me in more talk. It's embarrassing to meet anyone after farewells have been said, and that one, no. Half-dressed, and having hunted in vain for a second box of matches, I lay down on the bed, drew its purple quilt over me. After all, Mr. Bloom's secretary had not died in it, and blew out my candle. I must have at once fallen asleep, heavy and seemingly dreamless sleep, and now, as if in a moment I was awake again, completely wide awake, as if at an inward signal. Night had gone. The creeping grey of dawn was at the window. Its colder, mist-burdened airs filled the room. I lay a while inert, sharply scrutinizing my surroundings, realizing precisely where I was, and at the same time that something was radically and inexplicably wrong with them. What? It's difficult to suggest, but it was as if a certain aspect, the character of the room, its walls, angles, patterns, furniture, had been peculiarly intensified. Whatever was naturally grotesque in it was now more grotesque and less real. Matter seldom advertises the precariousness imputed to it by the physicist, but now every object around me seemed to be proclaiming its impermanence. The danger, so to speak, it was in. With a conviction that thrilled me like an unexpected touch of ice, I suddenly realized that this is how Mr. Champney's room would appear to anyone who had become, for some reason or another, intensely afraid. It may sound wildly preposterous, but there it is. I myself was not afraid. There was, as yet, nothing to be afraid of, and yet everything I saw seemed to be dependent on that most untrustworthy but vivid condition of consciousness. Once let my mind, so to speak, accept the evidences of my senses, then I should be as helpless as the victim of a drug or of the wildest nightmare. I sat there, stiff and cold, eyeing the door, and then I heard the sound of voices. The faint, hollow, incoherent sound that voices make at a distance in a large house. At that, I confess, a deadly chill came over me. I stepped soundlessly onto the floor, looked about me, but in vain, in the half-light for the coat I had been wearing the previous night, and slipped on instead a pair of Mr. Champney's slippers and the floral silk dressing-gown that hung on the door-hook. In these I was not exactly myself, but at any rate ready for action. It took me half a minute to unlock the door. Caution is snail slow. I was shivering a little, but that may have been due to the cold May morning. The voices were more distinct now. One of them, I fancied, was Mr. Bloom's. But there was a curious similarity between them, so much so that I may have been playing eavesdropper to Mr. Bloom talking to himself. The sound was filtering down from an upper room, the corridor beneath, and now, in its perspective, stretching out before me in the pallor of dawn, being as still as a drop scene in a theatre, the footlights out. I listened, but I could detect no words, and then the talking ceased. There came a sort of a thump at the other end of the house, and then, overhead, the sound as if someone retreating towards me, heavily, unaccustomedly, but at a pretty good pace. Inaction is unnerving, and yet I hesitated, detesting the thought of meeting Mr. Bloom again, and especially if he had company. But that little risk had to be taken. There was no help for it. I tiptoed along the corridor and looked into his study. The curtain at the further end of the room was drawn a little bit aside. A deep-piled Turkey carpet covered the floor. I crossed it soundlessly and looked in. The light here was duskier than in my own room, and at first, after one comprehensive glance, I saw nothing unusual, except that near at hand and beside a chair on which a black morning coat had been flung was a small bed, half covered by a travelling rug, and standing beside it a familiar pair of boots. Unmistakable, ludicrous, excellent boots. Empty as only boots can be, they squatted there side by side, like creatures by no means mute, yet speechless. And towards the foot of the bed, on a little round table drawn up beside it, lay the miscellaneous contents, obviously, of Mr. Bloom's pockets. The old gold watch and the spade guinea, a note case, a pocket-book, a pencil case, a scrap of carved stained ivory, an antique silver toothpick, a couple of telegram envelopes, a bunch of keys, a heap of loose money. I see them all. But I see even more distinctly, and it was actually hobnobbing with the spade guinea, a Yale key. Why Mr. Bloom emptied his pockets at night, I cannot guess, a mere habit, perhaps. To that habit, nonetheless, I owe perhaps the brevity of my acquaintance with him. There is, I suppose, no limit to human stupidity. Never until this moment had it occurred to me that Mr. Bloom himself might have been responsible for the loss of my key, that he had, in fact, purloined it. I stole nearer and examined his. Yale keys, at a casual glance, are almost as like one another as leaves on a tree. Was this mine? I was uncertain. I must risk it, and it baffles me why I should have been so fastidious about it. Mr. Bloom had not been fastidious. The distant footsteps seemed now to be dully thumping down a remote flight of wooden stairs, and it was unmistakably his voice that I heard faintly booming, as if in querulous protestation, and with all its manlier resonance and its gusto gone. Yes, yes, coming, coming, and the footsteps stumped on. Well, I had no wish to meddle in any assignation. I had long since suspected that Mr. Bloom's activities might have proved responsible for guests even more undesirable than myself, even though, unlike myself, they may perhaps be of a purely subjective order. Like attracts like, I assume, in any sphere. Still, raw prejudices such as mine were not exactly a fair test of his peculiar methods of spiritistic investigation. More generous critics might merely surmise that he had only pressed on a little further than most. That is all. A pioneer. What, as I turned round, I was not prepared for, was the spectacle of Mr. Bloom's bed. When I entered the room, I'm certain there had been nothing unusual about it, except that it had not been slept in. True, the light had meanwhile increased a little, but not much. No, the bed had then been empty. Not so now. The lower part of it was all but entirely flat, the white coverlet having been drawn almost as neat and close from side to side of it as the carapace of a billiard table. But on the pillow, the grey-flecked brown beard protruding over the turned-down sheet now showed what appeared to be the head and face of Mr. Bloom. With chin jerked up, I watched that face steadily, transfixedly. It was a flawless facsimile, waxen, motionless, but it was not a real face and head. It was an hallucination. How induced is quite another matter. No spirit of life, no livingness had ever stirred those soap-like stagnant features. It was a travesty, utterly devoid, whatever its intention, of the faintest hint of humour. It was merely a mask, a lifelike mask, past even the dexterity of a Chinese artist to rival, and, though I hardly know why, it was inconceivably shocking. My objections to indiscriminate spiritualism the evening before may have been hasty and shallow. They seemed now to have been grotesquely inadequate. This house was not haunted, it was infested. Cat's paw poor young Mr. Champneys may have been, but he had indeed helped with the chestnuts. A horrible weariness swept over me. Without another glance at the bed, I made my way as rapidly as possible to the door and broke into a run. Still thickly muffled with her last journey's dust, except for the fingerprints I afterwards noticed on her bonnet, and just as I had left her the previous evening, my car stood awaiting me in the innocent blue of dawn beneath the porch. So must Tobias have welcomed his angel. My heart literally stood still as I inserted the key. But all was well. The first faint purring of the engine was accompanied by the sound of a window being flung open. It was above and behind me, and beyond the porch I turned my head and detected a vague greyish figure, standing a little within cover of the hollies and ilexes. A short man, about 20 or 30 yards away, not looking at me. But he, too, may have been pure illusion, pure hallucination. When I had blinked and looked again, he was gone. There was no sunshine yet. The garden was as still as a mechanical panorama, but the hubbub, the gabbling, was increasing overhead. In an instant I had shot out from under the porch, and, dignity forgotten, was on my way helter-skelter round the semicircular drive. But, to my utter confusion, the gates at this end of it were heavily padlocked. I all but stripped the gears in my hasty retreat, but succeeded none the less, and then, without so much as turning my head towards the house, I drove clean across the lawn, the boughs of the blossom-burdened trees actually brushing the hood of the car as I did so. In 5 minutes I must have been nearly as many miles from Mr. Bloom's precincts. It was fortunate, perhaps, that the day was so early. Even the most phlegmatic of rural constables might look a little askance at a motorist desperately defying the speed limit in a purple dressing gown and red Morocco slippers. But I was innocent of robbery, for in exchange for these articles I had left behind me as valuable a jacket and a pair of brown leather shoes. I wonder what they'll fetch at the sale. I wonder if Mr. Bloom would have offered me Mr. Champney's full £300 per annum if I'd consented to stay. He was sorely in need, I am afraid, of human company, and a less easily prejudiced ally might have been able to help him in his extremity. But I ran away, and it is now too late to make amends. He's gone home, as we all shall, and taken his wages. And what troubles me, and now and then, with acute misgiving, is the thought of Miss Allgood. She was so simple and so easy a prey to enthusiasm. She dabbled her fingers in the obscure waters frequented by Mr. Bloom as heedlessly and as absorbedly as some little dark intense creature on the banks of the Serpentine over a gallipot of tiddlers. I hate to think of any of them taking her seriously, or even otherwise, and of the possibility also when she is groping her way through their underworld, for she never really found it in this, the possibility of her meeting him there. For whatever Mr. Bloom's company in his charming house may have consisted of, and here edges in the obscure problem of what creatures of our thoughts, let alone our dreams, are made on, and quite apart too from Mr. Bloom's personal appearance, character, and effects, my chief quarrel with him was his scorn of my old harmless family friend. I would like, if only I could, to warn her against him. Those dark, affectionate, saddened, hungry eyes. I used to have this as a repeat, so it was an automated one, but I thought it sounded terrible. So I thought, well, I'll record every one. But then I run out of things to say. All I want to say is come over to Patreon. You get ad-free stories. www.patreon.com/barkid. There's a link above there. So come on, and then I can stop boosting it. I don't really like the self-marketing stuff. I just like telling stories. But you've got to do it because you need to be paid. Or one needs to be paid. That's me. What am I going to say? I hope you're all well. I'm going to start talking about the story in a minute. I realise these kind of slightly unscripted things are actually better because YouTube doesn't think I'm a robot. So that was A Recluse by Walter de la Mare. I did a ton of notes about this. I got really into it. I've probably done far too many notes, to be honest. Anyway, so A Recluse, to be careful there, was first published in 1926 and later collected in On the Edge, issued by Faber and Guire in 1930. Walter de la Mare, you know, is a poet, really, who writes stories. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that his stories are very poetic, really. And in terms of where he is in English literature, he's Edwardian by sentiment. Now, by 1926, we were getting full-blown modernism, weren't we? We were getting Joyce, ultimately leading to Finnegan's Wake, but Ulysses, and then we were getting Virginia Woolf with Mrs. Dalloway, and we were getting T.S. Eliot with The Wasteland, and there was all this new forms. Now, he doesn't go that far. So, in a sense, he's using a Victorian form, the form of the haunted house story, if you like. But the sensibility is edging towards modernism. It is not a straight Victorian ghost story. What I mean is, he is a paint. He's a poet, but he's almost like a painter. So, in terms of it being a ghost story, not much happens, does it? Uh, a young man takes a detour, admires a house, misplaces a key, is persuaded to stay the night, endures an uneasy dinner, sleeps badly in a dead man's room, glimpses something on the pillow at dawn that may or may not be a head, and flees wearing another man's slippers. That's it. Um, if you're used to kind of M.R. James or even E.F. Benson, or most people, I mean, I think Algernon Blackwood is a very philosophical writer, but he has a narrative drive, you know. And if you're used to kind of like the pulp stories of the 20s that were in Clark Ashton Smith, again, another, it's not straightforward Ashton Smith, but Lovecraft, again, in their use of language, not completely just pulp, but things happen, don't they? Robert E. Howard, for example, the pulp writer, I think. Um, Walter de la Mare is not that. So nothing happens. There's no twist. There's no reveal. There's no mounting dread. There's no monster as such. It's just stuff that happens. Dash doesn't investigate or pursue. There's no revelation. He's not even massively curious about what's happening. I suppose he wanders around in the early dawn, so you could say that's it. But it's very different, and I see it as a painting. So, for example, he takes a detour on a May afternoon. So far, so good. This could be a classic ghost story. The roads are pleasant. We have the issue of the convalescent friend, and that serves some function, but it could have been left out, really. It doesn't really drive the story forward. And then we have the man on horseback with the weird parcel on his back, and that doesn't drive the story forward. And then we have the details, the very painterly details of the Moroccan leather, of the moon, of the mist, of the when he describes the food that they have, the asparagus salad. It could be a still life painting, and most of this stuff is for composition. It's so a writer writes a narrative, and what you're supposed to write are things that drive the story forward. Everything is these days, particularly, and that's a fashion. It will change, but everything needs to be for the service of the narrative. You're allowed to say things that develop character, but otherwise strip it out. That's a very Hemingway way of looking at things. It's kind of pervaded creative writing courses. So this isn't that at all. And this is your classic Walter de la Mare story. If you think something like Crew, or you think All Hallows, they're very atmospheric, and it's like looking at a painting. Now, the other thing I would say, and I often say this about visual art, is that visual art can be explained, but in explaining, we lose something. So the product, if you like, that's a vile phrase in that context, is we have the painting, we have the sculpture, and they are what they are. And we engage with them, And this is what this story is in many ways. And so I would say that people who come looking for your sort of pulp horror story are going to be disappointed with this. When I started thinking about this story, two thinkers came to mind, and these are thinkers who aren't ever far from my mind, because our mind is furnished with certain objects, and there are certain thinkers I don't know anything about, so I can't use them. But one of them is John Berger, who is a painter and a photographer and a critic of visual art. Um, and a Marxist, very interestingly. And the other was Carl Jung, who a Swiss, who was a psychoanalyst, um, and not a Marxist. And so I kind of approach the story from both of their points of view, and I actually think they're saying pretty much the same thing when we kind of. It's not a triangle. Is it a triangulation if there's only two? Um, Maybe I'm the third one. There we are. So let's think about Dash. I'm going to say something about his name. Dash. He dashes, doesn't he? That's his name. He dashes in, he dashes out. He's a surface man. And Bloom blooms. He he has the kind of heavy scent of an orchid, something a bit overripe to him, you know. The heavy smell of a very perfumed flower. Anyway, let's think about Berger. And so Berger, remember, is coming from this critique, and I think if we see Berger just as a Marxist, then we're doing him a disservice. He would probably see himself just as a Marxist, whether he'd be still a Marxist after all that's gone on with that particular way of looking at the world, i.e., all the people murdered in its name. But to understand him, what he says is, for example, when he's talking about easel painting, he talks about how for the people who owned these easel paintings and the people who commissioned these fine art works, it wasn't so much about the art itself, it was about the property and the object. So he says that we are trained to see the world as property. Our habits of looking, shaped by ownership and value, reduce experience to images that can be possessed, assessed, and made safe. It's not merely limiting but mistaken. It treats representation as reality and substitutes consumption for encounter. And he talks about how a man would be painted with his house, with his wife, and he would have all his nice clothes on, and that is an encapsulation of his possessions, what he owns. And in a sense, by putting them into a painting, he kind of makes them safe. This is mine now. So that's the first thing. Now, Dash comes to see the house because he's seen it described in very much the terms of possession. I think it was a pleasant residence. It was for for sale notice. So this thing of beauty, this house, is reduced to something that one can own. We talk about to enjoy property, enjoy the rights of property. So one is the views, is the possession of the property. We enjoy that. We enjoy the views. Certainly, a house is made to be beautiful. This house is made to be beautiful. There are things about it that are very beautiful, and when we own it, we enjoy it. And so, but it's ours, and we put fences around it. And we're not going to let any Tom, Dick, and Harry come into it. They're ours, you know. And so, something that is aesthetic becomes a possession. And I guess that is a Marxist view, or that's informed by Marxist analysis. You know, it wasn't Marx who said, "Oh, property is theft." I don't think it was Proudhon, who was an anarchist. I believe I'm right there. I may be wrong. And then I'm going to talk about. So I think the key point about Berger there is he's saying if we you think what's this got to do with the story? But I'll get into it. If we possess the house here, mon trésor, again, not, you know, my treasure. It's mine treasure, and I own it. And if we see it only as a possession, we're only seeing the surface. So I suppose the key thing in this analysis from Burgess' point of view is about surface and depth. It is about the actual thing and the representation of the thing. That we can possess the image of it, but that isn't really what it is. You know, it's far more than that. And we come to Carl Jung, and a slightly different lens, but we arrive at the same place, I think. So in a Jungian analysis, Dash would represent our little ego, who is like a man in a boat on a huge sea. But the ego is very arrogant. The ego thinks it's sufficient. The ego thinks this is it. It's in charge. The ego thinks it's in charge, right? And so he is presented with this house, which represents the deeper structure of the psyche, particularly the shadow. So in Jungian thought, we always think of the shadow of the nasty things that we don't want to own, and that's true. And that, in some sense, that's similar to Freud's personal unconscious. Or Freud didn't have a collective unconscious, so it's Freud's unconscious. But it's all the things we don't understand. It's all the things we don't comprehend. It's all the things that are in the dark, and they are not easy to understand. They're not formed properly. They are vague. It's not that they are there, they're not formed. So from a Jungian point of view, Dash is the ego, and the house and Bloom are the shadow. They are that which is not encompassed by the ego. So the ego is not master over any of this. It doesn't understand it. It doesn't see it. Okay. So what we've got is Berger saying that what exceeds the frame is screened out. Everything beyond the representation is ignored. And if we ignore that, we miss the possibility of genuine engagement. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. I'm just going to reiterate the Jungian thing. So the Jungian thing is the ego thinks we know it all, and here's the house, and we don't know anything about it really. And it represents those part of ourselves which we don't know and don't actually want to know. So going back to Berger. So Berger was influenced by a guy called Walter Benjamin, who was a German Jew, a German communist Jew, who fled to France. And then when the Nazis came, he fled again and actually killed himself rather than be captured by them. And I've got a book of his called The Arcades Project, but that's a different thing. Anyway, he talked about how, when we were able to represent art, so basically Van Gogh's, Van Gogh rather, his sunflowers everywhere, Monet's, is everywhere. And it's on a mug, it's on a mat, it's on, and these are not equivalent representations. When things are reproduced, we lose, Benjamin would talk about the aura of the original. So the original painting cannot be captured by a copy. So Berger, I think, is what Berger's saying is, and if we take it from a Bergerian point of view, Mon Trésor is not just its image that can be possessed. It is not simply something that one buys, enjoys, and is shallow. It's far deeper. And if we think that's all it is, we're making a mistake. So you see how I'm drawing this parallel between the Berger's view and Jung's view. And Jung is more straightforward, saying it is everything we don't know. Okay. So Dash and Bloom, we talked about that. And I maybe said this later on in the notes. Dash is merely a camera. How he records all these details, the color of the leather. When he sees Bloom, he gives you a very detailed description of him. Things like the dog eating its bone, things like the man on horseback. He's an indiscriminate camera. He views all these things, but he doesn't attempt to enter into them. He doesn't have any engagement with them. He's merely picturing them. So he's a very surface guy, So there we are. So as I said before, look again, jumping to Jung, the house is not only, but the house is the unconscious. It's Bloom. The Bloom and the house are equivalent. They're the same thing, really. They're just aspects of the same thing. And they are also a map of the psyche, of Dash's psyche, but that part of the psyche he does not own. That part of the psyche he does not approach, and he's frightened of, and he won't go to it. Anyway, the key goes missing. He's captured by the house and by Bloom. He's ready to leave. He doesn't want to engage in it. He's seen it. It was a beautiful place. He actually trespassed so that he could enjoy the possession of the house without paying for it. But he's captured by the house. The house is saying, come on in. So again, talking about Berger, so we get a very, he's extortionately substantial. He's a biggish fella. He's big. He's well dressed, but badly dressed. And his spectacles, his big spectacles. Now, Berger would talk about how in Portraits of Power, the person is often described is painted in great detail. His pocket watch and his suit and his hat and his dog and everything that he possesses. But the point of that is it obscures what's inside him. We don't see. All he is the man who owns these things. Whatever's inside him, we can't see because it's blocked by the facade of possession. And interestingly, you get this house, which is huge, and Dash doesn't really see any of it. He sees where he's going to sleep, and he sees the study, and he sees very little of it. And of course, the bizarre thing that Bloom is moving out, but hasn't moved out, and only moves out when he dies. Actually, he never moves out apart from when he's dead. And everything's crowded in. All the things that have been accumulated. Montresor's been in his family 200 years. His sisters lived there, so we've got like hundreds of years of lumber, if that's the right word. I think it is, which is just blocking the front of it. It's just piled up, and he's camping among it. So it's unassimilated. That's the point. There's so much in here that has not been worked through. And from a Jungian point of view, one of the tasks of the ego as it matures is to examine all this stuff that exists inside the psyche and bring it to light and put some kind of order on it, because it if it isn't ordered and understood, if the psyche, if the ego is not in a conscious relationship with the shadow, it will be possessed and dominated and prey to very dark forces that will overpower it. So Bloom himself is really interesting. If Bloom is a kind of a twin in a sense. He represents a house, but he's a twin of Dash. Um, he's a man with there's something inside him, but it's occult, isn't it? It's hidden. And the other thing I was going to say about jumping, what's really great about this story, I think it's probably one of Walter de la Mare's best stories, is the painterly style. And we're there, God, we're there with the night and we see it all. And the other thing is his characterization, particularly of Bloom. Dash is good. Dash is workaday. He's your standard everyman, the man in the Clapham omnibus or wherever he is now. Your bog standard bloke, your John Doe. That's who he is, and he refuses depth. Whereas Bloom's is all surface. His talk interrupting himself, his pomposity, he's going on about things, and he just never shuts up. And what he does is, by this, there are some very deep secrets in this house. And Bloom talks about himself at such length that they become dull. They are just boring. And so, Dash is actually hammered into being completely uninterested in any of this because Bloom is just, with his incessant talk, he's knocked him into submission. And so Bloom is all surface. There's nothing integrated. Everything in him comes out in speech. What is inside him? Does he have any thoughts inside, or is it all in speech? It's just avoidance of, again, this avoidance of the interior. Bloom does not look inside himself. It's all out there. It's all garbled. And this is the house. It's dark. Look at the house. There's an upstairs where there are thumps and people wandering around and Bloom talking to himself and all sorts of stuff. And Dash never sees any of it. It's all obscure. Dash isn't even massively curious about it either. So there we are. I want to mention Mrs. Allgood. She's the only woman in the story. And there are four characters, I suppose. Champneys, who's dead, Allgood, who's dead, but she's a woman. So in Jungian theology, that's a bit of a provocative term, but I did it on purpose. The way to the interior is by way of the anima in a man, which is the female spirit. It's the opposite in a woman. It's the animus, and she represents, yes, all those things we haven't integrated. But she represents longing in a man. She is the feeling of longing. She is the um, that impetus that makes us turn inward, that impetus that makes us seek something greater and bigger. She is the she holds the candle. She's tricky as well. She's a very complicated character, and she can appear to a man in different guises. You know, you think about. I can only speak as a heterosexual man because that's all I am. Um, but you know, when you first fall in love or you first have an interest in that longing for that other person is the anima. You mistake your love object for the anima, but the anima is not a person. She is the longing personified. Now, she is the muse. She is the guide into. She's Beatrice. She's the guide into the depths. So he Dash Bloom rather is very dismissive of her. She's an amateur. She's an old maid. She's nothing, you know. But she is the faint light that pointing the way to the interior. That Dash refused. He ridiculed her, but he's very defensive of her when Bloom does so because she means a lot to him. So um, she is a glimmer of light in the darkness. She is that light that points into the interior that both Bloom and Dash have failed in. So again, in Jungian thought, the idea is that one spirals towards a more integrated state where one absorbs and takes on and makes one's own more of this darkness until we become a more whole. And we recognize that we are two people. We are our little ego, but we are also everything else as well. Of course we are, but you know, it's hard to realize that. And we can fail in that process. This is called individuation, but we can fail and we can refuse it, or we can get lost in it. Two ways we can fail are we can just refuse the call. This is, of course, Joseph Campbell as well with the hero's journey. He was very influenced by Jung, and the other way to fail is to be possessed by it, and so we the ego is inflated by an unconscious component and cannot tell. It thinks itself to be that when it isn't. So you have to be able to be the ego and have the courage to go into the darkness and not be swallowed by the darkness. And you know, so we've said that. What else do I want to say? I've said about the clogging. I said about the failed integration. Champney is really interesting because Champney is also a failed initiate. He all we're left with are his flamboyant remnants. So he was physically weak. He was not sufficiently resilient. It's dangerous going into the dark. Don't. That's the whole point, you know. If you think that this is a simple process, this is life's call, and it breaks people. It is the dark night of the soul going into the darkness, and it's not an easy. It's a heroic quest. It's not a Disney hero. You know, we don't defeat the dragon easily like the knight in a Disney story. It requires massive sacrifice and grief and pain, and that's just, you know, I'd love to make it easy for you, but it isn't easy. Um, and then, of course, Champney says, "Not me at any rate." It's a failed attempt to do either of those two things, to either be brave enough to go into the dark and to resist being swallowed by the dark. So the to get too deep with you here, but that Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he cries out to the Lord about being abandoned, he really is abandoned, and he feels that. I think that's the mystery there. But yet he goes through the darkness still. And if we want to use the Christian story, he goes into death, into hell for 3 days and rises again. But it's not like, and I think if you're saying, "Oh yeah, it's okay, I'm going to go into death. It's going to be pretty awful for 3 days, but then it'll be okay." I think the whole point about this individuation process is when you are swallowed by the darkness, there is no guarantee you will not come out. You will come out again, and that, because if there was, it wouldn't be real. There we are. I hope this isn't too deep for you anyway. So, what else do I want to say? Yeah, those. I mean, there's so much to say about it. The idea that it's infested, rather than haunted, he uses the term infested. He tries to escape, but it's padlocked. The unconscious doesn't let you out so easily, and but you do get out. And of course, there's the head. What on earth is that? Well, it's the vacant head. It's vacant. He's emptied his pockets. Both of them empty their pockets, don't we? We have the description of the pile of stuff in Champney's room, and then we have the description of the stuff that's come out of Bloom's pockets, including the key, which allows him to escape. It's almost like Bloom has been emptied. He's a voice. He's never seen again, remember? And we have this wax mask. This, and that's what Bloom is. Bloom is a simulacrum in many ways. He's not real. There's nothing inside him anymore. He has been absorbed by the house, by the Borg in Star Trek terms. And of course, Dash runs away. And that's the whole point. He isn't brave enough to go through with this. And I think this is what the story is. So, I mean, I could go on at length, and I already have gone at length, but really, this is a story about encountering reality and failing the test of reality. And that's why I think it's a really profound story. And I've talked about Delamere's style, his painterly style, which is about context. But I definitely think that's what it's about. And from Burge's point of view, you know, as a painter, I used him because the story feels like a painting, and he has a lot to say about visual art and how it's presented to us and engaging with it and what it means. And so I think he goes past his Marxism there, and we can fail to engage with art because art's real. It's a real thing in the real world, and we can fail to engage with the world, the reality of our lives in the world. We have one life, maybe, who knows? We have a life, here we are. This is real. And to engage with it fully and not pretend it's a novel or a story like Dash is doing. He's living his Times supplement life, isn't he? Motoring around, pootling around, but he can't engage with the reality of life. And I do think that it's an easy thing to choose to live on the surface, and it's scary to go into the darkness. But to be honest, for many, if not most of us, we will go into the darkness. I don't mean death. Our lives will include some dark nights, and we will be in the situation of not knowing if there is a third day, and we will go into that dark. And that is the test, to go into the darkness and not be consumed by the darkness. And I think, to jump to Albert Camus a little bit, very different character in lots of ways, but the message really is, you know, he talks about Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And it is to go through the dark and not give in to nihilism, and not and that isn't the same as hope. It's endurance. It is a precondition for new life. Well, there we are. So that got a lot deeper than I thought. And I'm not even sure if you'll understand what I'm saying, but for me, honestly, that's what the story was about. I hope you enjoyed it. You don't have to listen to these bits, and I'm sure many of you will have gone, but those people who've gone, they haven't heard me say that. So anyway, I'll talk about, let's lighten it up. And I've had a bit of a wrestle with the dogs today. I saw my friend Danny for a cup of coffee. We talked about this and that. He's bought some new sneakers, trainers, and I was at the gym this morning. Saw Ryan. He's just a little boy, and so that's tough. But they're doing well. Mother, child, and Ryan are doing well. I did some kettlebell stuff and some squats and then I'm off to yoga. We're doing aerial yoga tonight, and somebody said I look younger than my age, and I said that to Ryan, and he said, "Well, give him my card." So if any of you, if you want a good PT, there's our Ryan. So he doesn't do the yoga, just physical stuff. So he's all right. We've got our kitchen and bathroom that's done now. I've got a reprint of the magazine that's gone well. It's all right, really. That's it. So I hope I didn't wasn't too much of a downer, but there is hope. I think that's my message. My message is behind all darkness flies the sun, as Tolkien would say, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done or bid the earth farewell. I may have misquoted him, but the sentiment's right.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?